I used to think the worst thing about Eleanor Whitfield was the way she said my name. Not Marin, the name my parents gave me, soft and easy, like water over stones. She said it like she was tasting something gone slightly off. Mar-en, two clipped syllables, dropped into a room like a verdict. I married her son, Caleb, on a windy October afternoon 3 years ago. In a backyard strung with fairy lights because we couldn't afford a venue and didn't want one anyway. Eleanor wore black to my wedding. Not navy, not charcoal black, the kind you wear to a funeral, and when my aunt commented on it, Eleanor smiled with her mouth and said, "Oh, I just feel most myself in black," as though that explained anything. As though it wasn't a message sent directly to me. I am mourning my son's choice. I should have understood then what I was walking into. But I was 26 and in love, and I believe the way you believe things before life teaches you otherwise, that kindness eventually softens people. That if I tried hard enough, cooked the recipes she liked, remembered her birthday, complimented her garden, she would come around. I believed Caleb's mother would, in time, become something like a mother to me too, since mine had passed when I was 19, and I had a hollow place shaped exactly like that word. She never did come around. If anything, the opposite happened. The longer Caleb and I stayed married, the more settled and happy we became, the more Eleanor's dislike of me curdled into something sharper. I think now, looking back with the clarity that only comes after surviving something, that my happiness was the actual offense. Not anything I did wrong. Just the fact that I existed, content, in a life she had wanted shaped differently. Eleanor had picked someone else for Caleb. A woman named Priscilla Hahn, daughter of her oldest friend from the country club. A woman who wore her hair the way Eleanor wore hers and laughed at the right moments and called Eleanor Mrs. Whitfield with the kind of deference that Eleanor mistook for respect, but was really just calculation. Priscilla had been groomed since high school, practically, to become a Whitfield. And then Caleb met me at a community college night class, Eleanor would say later. Like it was the first symptom of how unsuitable I was, and everything Eleanor had spent 20 years arranging fell apart over a shared laugh about a terrible textbook. She never forgave me for that. Not really. She smiled at family dinners. She bought me a gift at Christmas, always something slightly wrong: a scarf the color of a bruise, a cookbook for cuisine I'd once mentioned disliking. Little arrows, dressed as gestures. But Caleb was the reason I stayed standing through all of it. My husband is the kind of man who notices things. Not just the big things, he noticed those too, but the small ones. The way I'd go quiet after his mother's visits. The way my shoulders crept up toward my ears whenever her name came up on the caller ID. After our second Thanksgiving, when Eleanor spent the entire meal asking pointed questions about my background and my people in a tone that suggested she already had answers she didn't like. Caleb drove us home in silence, and then, in our kitchen, he put both hands on my face and said, "I'm sorry. That ends. I should have stopped it years ago, and I'm done letting her think she gets to do that." He called his mother the next day and told her that if she couldn't be civil to his wife, she wouldn't be welcome in our home. Eleanor cried, real or performed. I never knew which with her, and told him he was choosing a stranger over his own blood. Caleb said, calm as anything, "I'm choosing my wife." That's not the same as choosing a stranger. Maybe it's time you learned the difference. I loved him so much in that moment I thought my chest would crack open. That was the pattern of our marriage. Eleanor pushed. Caleb pushed back. Eleanor schemed. Caleb dismantled the scheme, usually with a directness that left her sputtering. It wasn't that he hated his mother. I don't think he ever stopped loving her. In the complicated, loyal way children love difficult parents, but he refused. Every single time, to let her cruelty land on me unanswered. He used to say, a husband's first loyalty is to the family he built, not the one he was born into. My mother raised me. You and I are building something new. I won't let her tear down the second thing to protect the memory of the first. I didn't know, when I got pregnant, that Eleanor's resentment had a ceiling and that we were about to find it. I found out I was pregnant in March. On a morning so ordinary. I remember the specific cereal I was eating. When the second pink line appeared, Caleb cried. Not delicately great, heaving, relieved sobs. The kind that surprised both of us, because we hadn't admitted out loud how much we'd wanted this. How many quiet disappointments had preceded it. We told his parents at Easter. His father, Walter, a soft, withdrawn man who had long ago surrendered any opinions of his own to Eleanor's louder ones, managed a real smile and a hug. Eleanor's face did something complicated, a flicker of something almost like joy, quickly replaced by calculation. Like she was recalculating a math problem that had just changed variables. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll see what kind of mother you turn out to be." Caleb's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard. A silent "I heard that. I'm here. Ignore her if you can, and I'll handle her if you can't." The pregnancy itself was difficult in ways that had nothing to do with Eleanor. I had hyperemesis for the first for months, was hospitalized twice for dehydration, lost 8 pounds. I didn't have to lose. Caleb took unpaid leave from his job at the engineering firm to take care of me, missing a promotion cycle. He never once mentioned missing. He learned to braid hair so he could pull mine back when I was sick. He learned the precise temperature of ginger tea that wouldn't turn my stomach. He learned, without being taught, the particular vocabulary of being scared for someone you love and not letting them see the full size of that fear. Eleanor visited exactly twice during those 4 months. Both times she brought small, expensive, useless gifts: a silver rattle, a cashmere blanket too delicate to actually use on a baby, and both times she made some comment designed to needle. "You're not still being sick, are you?" Priscilla's sister wasn't sick a single day with her pregnancy. Or, "I do hope this baby has the Whitfield chin. It would be such a shame to lose that bloodline." She'd trail off, leaving the insult to assemble itself in the silence. Caleb stopped those visits after the second one. "You don't get to come into our home and make her feel small while she's already struggling," he told his mother on the phone, loud enough that I could hear from the next room. "You can see her when you can do that without insulting her. Otherwise, no." By the 7th month, I was feeling better, the nausea gone, the nursery half painted a soft sage green, and we'd settled into a rhythm of nervous, hopeful waiting. We lived 40 minutes from Eleanor and Walter, close enough for family obligation, far enough for sanity, in a small rented house with a porch swing and a tendency for the pipes to groan in winter. It wasn't much. It was ours. In the 8th month, something shifted that I didn't notice until much later. In hindsight, the way you only see the shape of a trap after you're caught in it. Eleanor started being nice. She called more. She asked after my doctor's appointments with what seemed like genuine interest. She offered, out of nowhere, to host the baby shower, something Caleb and I discussed warily before agreeing. Because refusing felt cruel, and because, foolishly, we both wanted to believe people could change, especially now. On the cusp of a grandchild, she might finally soften. For the baby shower was, on its surface, lovely. Eleanor's house done up in pale yellows and creams, a beautiful cake, gifts piled high. She gave a toast that made some of the guests tear up, about new beginnings and family growing in unexpected directions. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest, relief. Maybe, or hope, the dangerous kind. I didn't know yet that hope, where Eleanor was concerned, was just rope she was giving me so the fall would hurt more. What I didn't learn until much later, pieced together from things Caleb's cousin let slip at the worst possible moment. Things I'll get to, was that around the same time, Eleanor had begun a different kind of project entirely. She had decided, somewhere in the calculus of her bitterness, that she could not stop the baby from being born a Whitfield by blood, but she could control what kind of mother I would be remembered as. She wanted, more than almost anything, for there to be a story and narrative, repeatable at family dinners and country club lunches for years, about how unfit I was, how unstable, how unworthy of the family name the baby would carry. She needed an opportunity, and due dates inconveniently for her plans. Are unpredictable things. My water broke on a Tuesday in November, 3 days before my due date, at 11:47 p.m. While Caleb and I were watching some forgettable show with the volume too low because we were both too tired to actually focus on it. "Oh," I said, sitting up to fast, feeling the warm gush before I fully understood it. "Oh, Caleb." He was off the couch before I finished his name, the calm dissolving into a controlled kind of urgency I'd never seen in him before, efficient and fast. Okay. Hospital bags by the door. I packed the car seat base in the car last week, just in case. You remember the breathing thing the class taught?" "I don't remember the breathing thing," I said, half laughing, half terrified. As the first real contraction arrived, like a fist closing around my spine. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, and kissed my forehead. And that was Caleb in one sentence. We'll figure it out together. In the chaos of grabbing bags and shoes, in the adrenaline fog of timing contractions on his phone while pulling on a coat, Caleb made a decision that would matter more than either of us understood in the moment. We had no family close by who could meet us at the hospital immediately. My own family was hours away by plane. My father retired to Arizona, my brother stationed overseas. Caleb's parents lived 40 minutes out. He called them anyway, because it was his mother and father. Because some loyalty doesn't fully die even when it should. Because he wanted his father there, at least for this. Mom, it's happening. Marin's water broke. We're heading to the hospital now. I heard Eleanor's voice through the phone, oddly bright. Oh, thank goodness. We'll come straight away. Caleb hung up and looked at me, something flickering across his face. That was almost normal, he said. Like he didn't trust it. Maybe she's excited about the baby, I said, through gritted teeth. Because another contraction was arriving, and I genuinely did not have room in my brain to think about Eleanor Whitfield. We should have known. We should have both known. But you don't think clearly when your body is doing the most enormous thing it has ever done. And grace, even unearned grace, is easy to accept when you're desperate for it. Labor was long, 14 hours. In the end, and brutal in the particular way labor is brutal. A violence the body does to itself in service of life. Caleb did not leave my side for 1 minute of it. He held my hand through contractions that made me say things I'm not proud of. He fed me ice chips and rubbed my lower back exactly where I told him to, and didn't flinch when I, at one particularly low point, told him this was entirely his fault, and I never wanted to be touched again as long as I lived. He laughed, gently, and said, "Noted. I'll revisit that statement with you later," and somehow that small joke got me through the next contraction. Walter and Eleanor arrived around AM and sat in the waiting room. Caleb went out once briefly, to update them, and came back looking strange and settled in a way I couldn't place and didn't have the bandwidth to ask about. Not with my body trying to turn itself inside out. Our daughter was born at 1:52 p.m. the next day. Eleanor June Whitfield, we'd decided weeks earlier. In a moment of either genuine warmth or terrible foresight, to give her Eleanor's name as a middle gesture of peace, something Caleb had suggested, and I'd agreed to, hoping it might finally build a bridge. I would think about the irony of that name choice many times in the weeks that followed. She was 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a furious, healthy cry. That, the nurse said, was a wonderful sign. Caleb cried again, the same unguarded sobs from the day he found out I was pregnant, and held our daughter like she was made of something more fragile than glass. Something more fragile than anything had ever been. "She's perfect," he kept saying. "She's perfect, Marin. Look what you did. Look what you made." I was exhausted in a way I'd never experienced, hollowed out and rebuilt at the same time. But I remember feeling, in that hospital room, something close to pure happiness. Caleb went out to tell his parents the news. Walter cried too, apparently, real tears, and held his granddaughter with the careful wonder of a man unused to being given soft things. Eleanor smiled and said all the right words, and asked to hold the baby. And I, drugged and drained, and wanting badly to believe in good endings, let her. I did not know, as Eleanor cradled my daughter, and murmured something to her too quiet for me to hear, that she had spent that entire 14-hour labor, not in the waiting room worrying about me, but on her phone, texting her sister-in-law, laying groundwork. I did not know that the almost normal warmth on the phone the night before had been, from the very beginning, a performance for an audience of exactly one, herself. Rehearsing the role she planned to play, I found out what Eleanor had actually been planning that night. When Caleb left the hospital for 90 minutes to go home, shower, grab the rest of our things, and feed our neglected cat, that was the window she'd been waiting for. The hospital, against my wishes, had a policy of moving new mothers to a recovery wing for the first night, where partners could stay, but other visitors had limited hours. Eleanor and Walter left around PM. Caleb left around PM, promising to be back within 2 hours. Kissing my forehead, kissing our daughter's tiny fist, telling the nurse on duty, a kind, weathered woman named Pearl who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, that he'd be right back, that she should call his cell for anything at all. I dozed, exhausted past the point of real sleep, drifting in and out. My daughter swaddled in the bassinet beside my bed. Around 9:40, my phone buzzed. "Eleanor, Caleb left his house key with us last week when we watered your plants for the trip you almost took. I have it. Want me to drop by tonight and leave some food in your fridge for when you come home? I know you'll be too tired to cook. I should have found this suspicious. I didn't. I was exhausted and touched, in my drugged haze, by what looked like thoughtfulness, by the same dangerous hope I'd felt at the baby shower. I texted back something like, "That would be really sweet. Thank you, Eleanor." What I did not know, what I would not learn until days later. Pieced together from security footage, a neighbor's doorbell camera, and Eleanor's own daughter-in-law shaped paranoia finally curdling into investigation was that Eleanor had no intention of simply dropping off food. She drove to our house. She let herself in with the key Caleb had genuinely, innocently, given her the week before. And she did something so deliberate, so calculated, that when I finally understood the scope of it, I felt something in me go cold and very, very still. She changed the locks. Not all of them, just enough. She called a locksmith she knew through the country club, someone who owed her husband a favor from some business dealing years back, and had him rekey the front door and the back door of our rental home. The home Caleb and I had lived in for 2 years. The home we were about to bring our daughter home to. She told the locksmith some story. I imagine it was about a son who'd lost his keys, or a daughter-in-law who couldn't be trusted with house security. Something plausible enough that he didn't ask too many questions, especially with cash changing hands. Then she left. She did not leave food in the fridge. She left nothing at all, except a house that, in roughly 14 hours, her own son would not be able to enter. Caleb got home that night, let himself in with his old key without issue because she hadn't touched it yet. The timing calibrated for the next day, for the homecoming itself, not for that night. Showered, grabbed our things, and returned to the hospital, none the wiser. I was asleep when he got back. He climbed into the uncomfortable recliner beside my bed, exhausted, and fell asleep, holding my hand through the bed rail. And that was the last quiet night before everything detonated. We were discharged the next afternoon. A cold, bright Thursday, the kind of crisp November day that should have felt like a beginning. The discharge nurse went through the checklist with the patient cheerfulness of someone who has said the same words 1,000 times. Watch for fever. Watch for excessive bleeding. Call if anything feels wrong. Trust your instincts over Google. And I nodded along, only half listening, already imagining the soft, familiar shape of our own bed waiting for me. The quilt my mother had made before she died. The nursery with its half-finished sage green walls and the crib we'd assembled wrong twice before finally getting it right. Caleb buckled our daughter into the car seat with the careful, fumbling reverence of a new father, checking the straps 4 times, then a 5th, tugging gently at the harness over her tiny chest to make sure it wasn't too tight or too loose, muttering instructions to himself from the parenting class we'd half paid attention to months earlier. 2 fingers between the strap and her collarbone. Okay. We're good. I sat in the back beside her the whole drive home, because I couldn't bear to have her out of arm's reach yet. This tiny, impossible person who was somehow ours, who had a nose exactly like Caleb's, and fingers so small. I kept counting them out of disbelief that 10 was really all there were. The drive felt longer than 40 minutes. Every red light felt like an imposition. Every pothole made me wince on her behalf, though she slept through all of it, undisturbed. While I watched her chest rise and fall and thought, not for the first time in those first 2 days, that I had never in my life cared about anything as fiercely as I cared about that small, steady rhythm. We pulled into the driveway a little after p.m. The house looked exactly as we'd left it 3 days earlier, porch light still on from the timer. The wreath I'd hung in October a little crooked. The same crack in the 3rd step that Caleb kept promising to fix. It should have felt like home. For about 90 seconds it did. Caleb carried the car seat up to the front door, balancing the diaper bag on his shoulder, while I followed slowly, sore, moving like someone twice my age, one hand pressed against the rail. He set the car seat down gently on the welcome mat and reached into his pocket for his keys. The same keyring he'd carried for 2 years, the one with the small enamel pin I'd given him for our anniversary, shaped like a tiny house. The key didn't turn. He tried again. Jiggled it the way you do when you assume it's user error, not a fundamentally changed lock, the universal, hopeful little wiggle of someone who doesn't yet want to believe what's in front of him. Tried the back door key on the front lock out of confusion, though he knew, even as he did it, that it wouldn't work, that keys don't simply forget which door they belong to. walked around to the back door, his shoes crunching over the dead leaves. We hadn't gotten around to raking. And tried that key too. Nothing. The deadbolt sat there, smug and unmoving. A different shape entirely from the one he knew by feel. "What the hell," he said quietly. And I watched something shift across his face from the porch where I stood, confusion first. Then the specific, dawning fury of a man putting together a puzzle he didn't want solved. Piece by terrible piece. "Maybe the lock's just stuck," I said, shivering, my body still raw and unsteady. The stitches from the delivery aching in a way that made standing for too long feel like a small punishment. Our daughter beginning to fuss in her car seat on the porch, hungry probably, or just unsettled by the cold and the unfamiliar jolting of the car ride. "Try again." He came back around to the front and tried again. And again. And then he stood very still for a moment, staring at the door the way you'd stare at a stranger wearing your spouse's coat, and said, "Marin, this lock has been changed. This is a different lock than the one that was on this door 3 days ago." I'd know. I oiled the damn thing myself last month. It had a specific catch right before it turned, and that catch is gone. This isn't the same hardware. I felt the cold reach a different part of me then. Something beyond the physical chill of standing on a porch in November, 48 hours postpartum. Our daughter's cries, climbing now from fussing into something more insistent, more urgent. The particular wail that meant she'd had enough of the cold and the car seat and the unfamiliar jostling of a world she'd only just entered. Who would change our locks? He already knew. I could see it arrive in his face like a held breath, finally released, ugly and certain, his jaw tightening into a shape I'd only seen once or twice before, both times in defense of me. He called his mother. She didn't answer. He called again. Nothing. On the third call, she picked up, and her voice was light, almost musical. The way it got when she was about to say something cruel and dress it as an accident. "Caleb, darling, what's wrong?" "Mom, did you go to our house 2 nights ago?" A pause, performed to perfection. "I might have stopped by. Why? Did you change our locks?" "Oh, that," she said, and I could hear, even through the phone, the smile in it, the satisfaction. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I think the locksmith might have wrecked the wrong door by mistake. I'd asked him to look at the lock on my own rental property, and I suppose there was some mix-up, what with everything going on, the baby and all. I'll have him come sort it out, but it might take a day or two. He's quite booked by mistake," Caleb repeated, his voice gone flat in a way I'd never heard before, not even close. "You changed the locks on our house the day my daughter was born, by mistake, Caleb. I really don't appreciate the tone. We are standing outside in the cold," he said, "with a newborn who is 2 days old, and you are telling me this was a mistake. I will never forget what happened next, because it is the moment I understood, fully and finally, the difference between the family I had married into by blood and the family I had built by choice." Caleb did not yell. He did not break. He looked at me, at our daughter crying now in earnest, at my face, which I'm sure showed every bit of the exhaustion and humiliation and fear I felt, and something in him set, like concrete finding its final shape. "Get in the car," he said gently to me. "We're going to a hotel. I'll deal with this." "Caleb, I'm not arguing with her on a porch with you both freezing," he said. "I'm getting my family somewhere warm. Then I am going to deal with my mother." We checked into a hotel 20 minutes away. A perfectly ordinary Hampton Inn off the highway. The kind of place with a stale lobby smell and a continental breakfast advertised on a banner that had clearly hung there for years. That felt, in that moment, like the safest place on earth. Caleb got us settled diapers, formula backup in case my milk hadn't fully come in yet and I needed the bottle we'd packed just in case. The portable bassinet we kept in the trunk for exactly this kind of unpredictable situation. Though neither of us could have predicted this. He moved through the small room with a kind of grim efficiency, setting up the bassinet beside the bed, testing the thermostat twice to make sure it wasn't too cold, propping pillows behind my back so I could sit upright without pulling at my stitches. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, not because it was his fault, but because some part of him, the part that had spent 3 years apologizing on his mother's behalf, couldn't yet separate her actions from some inherited sense of his own responsibility for them. I should have seen this coming. I should have known better than to give her that key. "You gave her a key because you trusted her," I said, exhausted, watching him fuss over the room. "That's not a character flaw, Caleb. That's just decency. She's the one who decided to use it like a weapon. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his hands hanging between his knees. And for a moment he looked, despite his size, despite the calm authority he usually carried, like a much younger man, like the boy who must have spent years absorbing his mother's particular brand of control before he'd learned how to push back against it. I keep thinking about how cold it was out there, how long we stood on that porch before I figured it out. Eleanor June was crying, and I couldn't even get the door open for her. You got us somewhere warm within 20 minutes, I told him, reaching for his hand. That's what matters. That's what she's going to remember eventually. If she remembers any of this at all, not the locked door, but the fact that her father fixed it, only once all of that was handled, only once his wife and daughter were warm, fed, and safe, the formula bottle washed and ready for the next feeding. The diaper bag restocked from the hotel's overpriced gift shop because we'd left half our supplies sitting useless on a porch we couldn't access. Did Caleb leave the room, stand in the hallway, and call a locksmith of his own? Not Eleanor's locksmith, his own, found through a 5-minute search on his phone while pacing the hallway carpet, paid for out of his own pocket, scheduled for that same evening, to meet him at our house and change the locks back, new locks. This time, that only he and I would have keys to. Not his parents, not anyone. He stood by the window of that hallway for a long time after making the call, looking out at the parking lot lights. And when he came back into the room, his face had settled into something quieter and more resolved than the fury from the porch, the look I'd learned over the years. That meant he had finished feeling something and started planning around it instead. Then he called his father. Part 6. The Reckoning. Beggins. Walter Whitfield was, by every account I'd gathered over 3 years of marriage, a man who had spent decades being quietly steamrolled by his wife. He didn't argue with Eleanor. He absorbed her decisions like weather, something to be endured rather than fought. I think Caleb had inherited some early instinctual understanding of how corrosive that kind of passivity could be, and had spent his whole adult life actively, deliberately, refusing to become his father in that one specific way. Dad, Caleb said, when Walter picked up, I need you to listen to me. And I need you to actually hear what I'm telling you, not what you want it to mean. He laid it out plainly. The locked door, the newborn in the cold, Eleanor's breezy, weaponized apology. Walter was quiet for a long moment. She told me she stopped by to drop off a casserole, Walter said finally, his voice strange, like a man waking up slowly to a room he'd been sleeping in for years without really looking at it. She didn't mention the locks at all. She changed them on purpose, Dad. She wanted us locked out. The timing isn't a coincidence. She did it the night of the birth, knowing we'd be discharged in a day or two, knowing exactly when we'd be standing on that porch. Caleb, I'm sure she didn't think it through. She gets these ideas about her properties and locksmiths and Dad. Caleb's voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened audibly, even over the phone. I am not calling to debate whether my mother is a careless person who makes mix-ups. I am calling to tell you that your granddaughter was 2 days old in November outside because your wife wanted to make a point. I need you to actually look at that, not soften it, not explain it away. Look at it. There was a long silence. And then Walter said something that, according to Caleb, he had never said in 31 years of marriage. I need to think. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an alliance. But it was, Caleb said later, the first crack in 40 years of a dam that should have broken decades earlier. That night, while I slept in the hotel room with our daughter against my chest, Caleb did something I didn't fully understand the scope of until much later. He drove to our house to meet the new locksmith, supervised the lock change personally, took photos of the old, illegally changed locks as evidence, and then sat in his car in our driveway for 40 minutes, composing a single, careful email. He sent it to his mother. He CC'd his father. He CC'd his Aunt Patricia, Eleanor's older sister, a woman who had never much cared for Eleanor's heirs and had, over the years, become something like a quiet ally to Caleb, someone who saw through Eleanor's performances even within the family. And in a move that would matter enormously later, he CC'd Eleanor's brother, Eleanor's mother, Caleb's grandmother, still sharp as a tack at 84 and notoriously unimpressed by Eleanor's social theater, and 3 of Eleanor's closest country club friends, women whose good opinion Eleanor had spent decades cultivating like a garden. The email was not cruel. It was not even particularly angry in tone. It was, Caleb told me, the most carefully restrained piece of writing he'd ever produced. Because he wanted no one to be able to dismiss it as an overreaction, he laid out, factually, with photos attached, what had happened. The locksmith's invoice. He'd gotten a copy from the locksmith himself, a man named Russo who, once he understood what Eleanor had actually done, was more than willing to cooperate, mortified at having been used this way. The timestamp showing the locks were changed the same night I gave birth, the hospital discharge paperwork timestamp, and a single photo of our daughter's hospital bassinet card with her name and birth time, set beside a photo of the new lock invoice dated that same evening. The email read, in part, I'm sharing this because I think everyone deserves to know what actually happened, rather than whatever version gets told at the next family gathering. Mom let herself into our home using a key I gave her in good faith, and had the locks changed the same night her granddaughter was born, not days later. Not by accident, but that same night, hours after, I called her with the happy news. 2 days later, Marin and I stood outside our own home in November weather with a newborn, locked out, while Mom offered an apology that amounted to oops. I don't think that's a mistake. I think it was a message, and I think everyone who receives this email should understand exactly what message was being sent, and to whom. I love my mother. I am not writing this to destroy her. I am writing this because I am done being the only person in this family who holds her accountable for how she treats my wife. And I think it's time the rest of you decided whether you're willing to do the same. Eleanor called him 11 times that night. He didn't answer once. He came back to the hotel, climbed into bed beside me, and held both me and our daughter until I fell asleep, his jaw still tight with an anger I'd never seen him direct at anyone before, not even at the worst of his mother's previous behavior. What happened over the following 2 weeks was, in its own quiet way, more dramatic than anything I could have scripted. Aunt Patricia called Eleanor first, and according to what we later heard from Caleb's cousin Devin, who happened to be visiting Patricia that week and witnessed the call, it was not a gentle conversation. Patricia had spent 30 years watching her younger sister build a life on careful appearances, on country club standing, on the performance of a perfect family, and she had apparently been waiting, with the patience of an older sibling who has seen everything, for the moment Eleanor's carefully constructed image finally cracked in public. You locked a newborn out in November, Patricia reportedly said, and you're going to explain to me right now. What kind of woman does that and then calls it an accident? Eleanor's mother, Caleb's grandmother, a formidable woman named Josephine, who had outlived two husbands and, by all accounts, several lesser feuds, did not call at all. She simply showed up at Eleanor's house 3 days later, unannounced, and according to Walter, who witnessed the visit, said exactly one sentence before leaving, I raised you better than this, and I am ashamed that I apparently didn't raise you well enough. She left without another word, and didn't speak to Eleanor again for almost a month. The country club friends were perhaps the cruelest blow, in the way that social punishment among that particular set of people always is, cold, indirect, devastating. Eleanor was, within 2 weeks, quietly uninvited from a holiday planning committee she had chaired for 6 years. No one said it was about the locked door. No one had to. The email had circulated forwarded, it turned out, by more than one recipient. The photos and timestamps doing exactly the damning work Caleb had intended, and Eleanor walked into her next club luncheon to find a coolness in the room that she, master of social temperature as she was, recognized immediately, and could not talk her way out of, for the first time in longer than I'd known her. Eleanor Whitfield was the subject of gossip instead of its author. Walter's transformation was the slowest, and in some ways the most meaningful. He didn't confront Eleanor immediately. Old habits, decades of avoidance, don't dissolve in a single email. But he started, quietly, doing things he'd never done before. He drove to the hotel alone, the day after Caleb's email went out, and knocked on our door, holding a bag of groceries and an expression I'd never seen on him. Shame. Plain and unguarded. I should have come the moment you called, he told Caleb, standing in the hotel doorway. I should have come a long time before that, honestly. I want to see my granddaughter, if that's all right, and I want to say I'm sorry, not for Eleanor, for myself, for 30 years of letting her decide who gets treated with respect in this family and who doesn't. He held baby Eleanor June for an hour that afternoon, and cried again, the second time in days, and told us quietly that he'd be filing for a temporary separation from his wife, not a divorce. Not yet. He wasn't ready to say that word, but a separation, a space to think, a refusal to keep living inside her version of events. She's going to tell everyone I'm having some kind of breakdown, Walter said. Let her. I'd rather be the man having a breakdown than the man who watched his granddaughter freeze on a porch and called it nothing. Here's the thing about people like Eleanor. Their power has always depended on an audience that either believes their version of events or is too polite to cowed, too invested in peace to challenge it. Take away the audience, and the performance has nowhere to go. Eleanor tried for a while to rebuild her narrative. She told people I had always been unstable and that Caleb's email was an overreaction orchestrated by a daughter-in-law who'd never liked her. She told her bridge club that Caleb was going through something and that she feared for his marriage, framing herself as the concerned mother rather than the architect of cruelty. But narratives require corroboration. And Eleanor had spent so many years cultivating an image of effortless grace that she'd never built any real reservoir of goodwill to draw on when she needed people to simply take her word for something. Patricia wouldn't back her up. Josephine actively contradicted her at a family gathering, telling anyone who asked the plain truth. My daughter changed the locks on her own son's house the night his child was born. There is no version of that story where she is the victim. Even Priscilla Hahn, the woman Eleanor had once dreamed her son would marry Waden, unexpectedly, at a mutual friend's dinner party. When someone brought up the whole Whitfield mess, Priscilla, who had married someone else years ago and had no particular stake in defending Eleanor anymore, reportedly said, honestly, I dated around that family long enough to know Eleanor doesn't do anything by mistake. She does it by design and calls it an accident when she gets caught. That line made its way back to Eleanor within days, the way these things always do, and by every account. It was the line that broke something in her. Not guilt. Exactly, I don't think Eleanor was capable of guilt in the way most people experience it, but something adjacent to it, the dawning, horrified, understanding that the image she'd spent her whole life building had just been publicly, irreversibly cracked by the one family member whose silent loyalty she'd never had to question before. She tried calling me. Eventually, about 3 weeks after the incident, I almost didn't answer. Caleb, sitting beside me on the couch with our daughter asleep on his chest, told me, you don't have to take this call. You don't owe her anything. But I wanted to hear what she would say. Some part of me, even after everything, still wanted to understand the why of it. The way you sometimes need to look directly at the thing that hurt you in order to finally let it go. Marin, Eleanor said, her voice tight, formal, none of its usual silk. I think this has all gotten quite out of hand. I'd like us to put it behind us, for the sake of the baby. You locked us out of our house the night I gave birth, I said. It was the first time in 3 years I'd spoken to her without softening myself. First, without pre-apologizing for taking up space. You let yourself believe that was something I'd just put behind us. It was a misunderstanding with the locksmith, Eleanor. I said her name the way she'd always said mine, flat, unimpressed, finished. I'm not going to argue with you about what happened. Caleb has photos. He has the locksmith's statement. He has the time stamp from hospital. There's no version of this where it was a mistake, and we both know it. What I want to know is why. Why did you want to hurt us that badly, on that day, of all days? There was a long silence on the line. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Whitfield said something that sounded less like a performance and more like an actual, unguarded thought. Because I was losing him, she said quietly. I'd been losing him for years to you, and I thought I don't know what I thought. I thought if I could make that day hard enough, ugly enough, you'd see what it costs to be part of this family on your terms instead of mine. I wanted you to need me. I wanted there to be a moment where you had no choice but to come to me for help. And I would be gracious. And the story going forward would be that I rescued you. Instead of the story being that you didn't need me at all. It was, I think, the most honest thing she ever said to me. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo the cold porch, the crying baby, the betrayal of a key given in trust. But it gave me, finally, the shape of the wound she'd been trying to inflict for 3 years. Not simple dislike, but a desperate, ugly bid for relevance in a story that had, increasingly, stopped needing her at all. You'll never be that story, I told her. Not because I'm punishing you. Because you made sure of it yourself. The night you decided a locked door mattered more than your granddaughter's first night home. Caleb chose his family the day he married me, and he chose it again, completely, the day you tried to hurt us. That's not going to change because you're sorry now that there were consequences." I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt something quieter than that, a kind of settling. Like a door closing gently instead of slamming. Part 9. What justice actually looked like. You want to be honest about something. There was no single dramatic confrontation that fixed everything. No movie-style moment where Eleanor fell to her knees and the family rejoiced. Real consequences are slower and stranger than that, built from 100 small withdrawals rather than one grand reckoning. Walter's separation from Eleanor became permanent within 6 months. He didn't ask for much in the divorce. He'd never cared about money the way Eleanor did, but he did something that mattered more to Caleb than any settlement could have. He chose, deliberately, publicly, to spend every single holiday with us going forward, breaking a 30-year pattern of letting Eleanor dictate where the family gathered. The first Thanksgiving after the separation, Walter sat at our small kitchen table, held his granddaughter through the whole meal, and told us it was the best Thanksgiving he'd had in years, and he meant it with his whole worn, finally honest face. Eleanor's social standing never fully recovered. Not because anyone organized a campaign against her, nothing so neat, but because the truth, once it escapes containment, has a way of quietly reshaping a room's temperature permanently. She lost the holiday committee position for good. Several of her closest friends drifted, the way people drift from someone they've realized they never actually liked, just tolerated for proximity's sake. She moved eventually to a smaller condo across town. And the unspoken story that followed her there, the one about the locked door, the newborn, the mistake, followed her too. The way reputations do in towns small enough for memory to matter. Josephine, Caleb's grandmother, made a decision in her will a year later that none of us saw coming. And that, frankly, felt like more justice than I ever expected to witness directly. She left the bulk of a small but meaningful inheritance, money that had always been assumed, by everyone including Eleanor, to pass down through Eleanor as the eldest daughter directly to Caleb and me instead, for the raising of my great-granddaughter, by parents who understand what family is actually supposed to mean. It wasn't a fortune, but it covered our house down payment 2 years later. The first home we ever owned outright, with locks that only we controlled. On a street Eleanor had never once visited. Eleanor was not invited to Eleanor June's first birthday party. This was not punishment exactly. Caleb framed it, when he told his mother, as simple honesty. "I'm not ready to trust you around my daughter yet," he said. "Trust isn't owed. It's earned back slowly, if at all. And you haven't started earning it." She did, to her credit, and I want to be fair here. Because growth, even late and imperfect growth, deserves acknowledgement. Begin trying, in small ways, over the following 2 years. She sent a card on Eleanor June's second birthday with an actual, handwritten note rather than a generic verse. She asked, humbly, almost unrecognizably humbly, if she could visit on neutral terms, supervised, slow. Caleb allowed small visits eventually, watching her like a hawk the entire time. And I'll admit there were moments where I saw something that looked almost like genuine tenderness pass over Eleanor's face when she looked at her granddaughter, something that made me wonder if some buried, better version of her had simply been suffocated for decades under all that performance and resentment. But the relationship never went back to what it might have been if she'd simply chosen kindness from the beginning. Some doors, once locked, don't open all the way again, no matter how many keys get offered afterward. Part 10. What Caleb taught me. People ask me sometimes, now that years have passed and Eleanor June is in school, and the worst of that winter feels like a story about someone else's life, what got us through it? And I always say the same thing: Caleb did. Not because he fixed his mother, he never did, not fully. Not in the way storybooks promise, but because he never once made me carry the weight of choosing between them. I think about all the ways a different husband might have handled that night. He might have minimized it. "She didn't mean it, Marin, don't make this bigger than it is." He might have asked me to extend grace I didn't have left to give, to smooth things over for the sake of family peace. The way so many husbands ask their wives to absorb the cost of other people's cruelty in the name of harmony. He might have stayed quiet, the way his father stayed quiet for 30 years, telling himself silence was the same thing as peace. Caleb did none of that. He stood on a freezing porch with a newborn and a postpartum wife and made an immediate, unwavering choice. My family comes first, and I will prove that with actions, not just words. He didn't yell at his mother in the heat of the moment, didn't let his anger turn into something messy and easily dismissed. He documented. He communicated clearly and factually to the people whose opinions Eleanor actually valued. He let consequences do the talking instead of trying to win an argument Eleanor would have twisted regardless, and every single day since, in smaller, quieter ways, he has kept choosing it. He defends me still, when his extended family makes the occasional thoughtless comment. He tells our daughter, even now, too young to fully understand it, that her mother is the strongest person he knows. He never once, in 3 years of marriage, and the hardest night either of us has lived through, made me feel like loving me cost him something he resented paying. I think that's the real lesson buried in everything that happened, not the satisfying parts. Though those mattered, the social reckoning and the will, and Josephine's blistering one-sentence judgment, and Patricia's refusal to enable her sister's cruelty. The real lesson is smaller and applies to every marriage, not just ours. A husband who will not protect his wife from his own family's cruelty has already chosen a side, whether he admits it or not. Silence is a side. Minimizing is a side. She didn't mean it is a side. And a husband who chooses again and again, clearly and without flinching, to put his wife and children first, who treats that choice not as a betrayal of his parents but as the basic architecture of a healthy family, gives his wife something no amount of revenge or reckoning ever could. The simple, bone-deep knowledge that she is not standing alone. Eleanor locked us out of a house that night, but she never once succeeded in locking Caleb's loyalty out of where it belonged. And in the end, that was the only lock that actually mattered. Part 11. The last conversation. There is one more conversation I haven't told you about, because for a long time I wasn't sure it belonged in this story at all. It felt too small, too quiet, to sit beside everything that came before it. But I've come to think it might be the most important part. It happened almost 2 years after the night of the locked door, on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. Eleanor had asked through Walter if she could see Eleanor June's school art show, just that, nothing more. A public event where she could stand at a respectful distance and watch her granddaughter point proudly at a finger-painted sun taped to a cafeteria wall. Caleb had agreed cautiously, the way he agreed to most things involving his mother by then, with conditions, with limits, with the quiet vigilance of a man who had learned not to assume good behavior just because enough time had passed. Eleanor showed up alone, dressed down from her usual country club polish, in a plain coat that looked almost unfamiliar on her. She stood near the back of the cafeteria, watching our daughter explain her painting to a cluster of other 4-year-olds with the serious, self-important focus only small children can manage. There's no version of this where it was a mistake, and we both know it. What I want to know is why. Why did you want to hurt us that badly, on that day, of all days? There was a long silence on the line. And then, for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Whitfield said something that sounded less like a performance and more like an actual, unguarded thought. Because I was losing him, she said quietly. I'd been losing him for years to you. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought if I could make that day hard enough, ugly enough, you'd see what it cost to be part of this family on your terms instead of mine. I wanted you to need me. I wanted there to be a moment where you had no choice but to come to me for help. And I would be gracious. And the story going forward would be that I rescued you. Instead of the story being that you didn't need me at all. It was, I think, the most honest thing she ever said to me. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo the cold porch, the crying baby, the betrayal of a key given in trust. But it gave me, finally, the shape of the wound she'd been trying to inflict for 3 years. Not simple dislike, but a desperate, ugly bid for relevance in a story that had, increasingly, stopped needing her at all. You'll never be that story, I told her. Not because I'm punishing you. Because you made sure of it yourself. The night you decided a locked door mattered more than your granddaughter's first night home. Caleb chose his family the day he married me. And he chose it again, completely, the day you tried to hurt us. That's not going to change because you're sorry now that there were consequences. I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt something quieter than that, a kind of settling. Like a door closing gently instead of slamming. I want to be honest about something. There was no single dramatic confrontation that fixed everything. No movie-style moment where Eleanor fell to her knees and the family rejoiced. Real consequences are slower and stranger than that, built from 100 small withdrawals rather than one grand reckoning. Walter's separation from Eleanor became permanent within 6 months. He didn't ask for much in the divorce. He'd never cared about money the way Eleanor did, but he did something that mattered more to Caleb than any settlement could have. He chose, deliberately, publicly, to spend every single holiday with us going forward, breaking a 30-year pattern of letting Eleanor dictate where the family gathered. The first Thanksgiving after the separation, Walter sat at our small kitchen table, held his granddaughter through the whole meal, and told us it was the best Thanksgiving he'd had in years, and he meant it with his whole worn, finally honest face. Eleanor's social standing never fully recovered. Not because anyone organized a campaign against her, nothing so neat, but because the truth, once it escapes containment, has a way of quietly reshaping a room's temperature permanently. She lost the holiday committee position for good. Several of her closest friends drifted, the way people drift from someone they've realized they never actually liked, just tolerated for proximity's sake. She moved eventually to a smaller condo across town, and the unspoken story that followed her there, the one about the locked door, the newborn, the mistake, followed her too. The way reputations do in towns small enough for memory to matter. Josephine, Caleb's grandmother, made a decision in her will a year later that none of us saw coming, and that, frankly, felt like more justice than I ever expected to witness directly. She left the bulk of a small but meaningful inheritance, money that had always been assumed, by everyone including Eleanor, to pass down through Eleanor as the eldest daughter directly to Caleb and me instead, for the raising of my great-granddaughter, by parents who understand what family is actually supposed to mean. It wasn't a fortune, but it covered our house down payment 2 years later. The first home we ever owned outright, with locks that only we controlled, on a street Eleanor had never once visited. Eleanor was not invited to Eleanor June's first birthday party. This was not punishment exactly. Caleb framed it, when he told his mother, as simple honesty. "I'm not ready to trust you around my daughter yet," he said. "Trust isn't owed. It's earned back slowly, if at all. And you haven't started earning it." She did, to her credit, and I want to be fair here. Because growth, even late and imperfect growth, deserves acknowledgement. Begin trying, in small ways, over the following 2 years. She sent a card on Eleanor June's second birthday with an actual, handwritten note rather than a generic verse. She asked, humbly, almost unrecognizably humbly, if she could visit on neutral terms, supervised, slow. Caleb allowed small visits eventually, watching her like a hawk the entire time. And I'll admit there were moments where I saw something that looked almost like genuine tenderness pass over Eleanor's face when she looked at her granddaughter, something that made me wonder if some buried, better version of her had simply been suffocated for decades under all that performance and resentment. But the relationship never went back to what it might have been if she'd simply chosen kindness from the beginning. Some doors, once locked, don't open all the way again, no matter how many keys get offered. After Warple ask me sometimes, now that years have passed and Eleanor June is in school, and the worst of that winter feels like a story about someone else's life, what got us through it? And I always say the same thing: Caleb did. Not because he fixed his mother, he never did, not fully. Not in the way storybooks promise, but because he never once made me carry the weight of choosing between them. I think about all the ways a different husband might have handled that night. He might have minimized it. "She didn't mean it. Marin, don't make this bigger than it is." He might have asked me to extend grace I didn't have left to give, to smooth things over for the sake of family peace. The way so many husbands ask their wives to absorb the cost of other people's cruelty in the name of harmony. He might have stayed quiet, the way his father stayed quiet for 30 years, telling himself silence was the same thing as peace. Caleb did none of that. He stood on a freezing porch with a newborn and a postpartum wife and made an immediate, unwavering choice. My family comes first, and I will prove that with actions, not just words. He didn't yell at his mother in the heat of the moment, didn't let his anger turn into something messy and easily dismissed. He documented. He communicated clearly and factually to the people whose opinions Eleanor actually valued. He let consequences do the talking instead of trying to win an argument Eleanor would have twisted regardless, and every single day since, in smaller, quieter ways, he has kept choosing it. He defends me still, when his extended family makes the occasional thoughtless comment. He tells our daughter, even now, too young to fully understand it, that her mother is the strongest person he knows. He never once, in 3 years of marriage, and the hardest night either of us has lived through, made me feel like loving me cost him something he resented paying. I think that's the real lesson buried in everything that happened, not the satisfying parts. Though those mattered, the social reckoning and the will, and Josephine's blistering one-sentence judgment, and Patricia's refusal to enable her sister's cruelty. The real lesson is smaller and applies to every marriage, not just ours. A husband who will not protect his wife from his own family's cruelty has already chosen a side, whether he admits it or not. Silence is a side. Minimizing is a side. She didn't mean it is a side. And a husband who chooses again and again, clearly and without flinching, to put his wife and children first, who treats that choice not as a betrayal of his parents but as the basic architecture of a healthy family, gives his wife something no amount of revenge or reckoning ever could. The simple, bone-deep knowledge that she is not standing alone. Eleanor locked us out of a house that night, but she never once succeeded in locking Caleb's loyalty out of where it belonged. And in the end, that was the only lock that actually mattered. There is one more conversation I haven't told you about, because for a long time I wasn't sure it belonged in this story at all. It felt too small, too quiet, to sit beside everything that came before it. But I've come to think it might be the most important part. It happened almost 2 years after the night of the locked door, on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. Eleanor had asked through Walter if she could see Eleanor June's school art show, just that, nothing more. A public event where she could stand at a respectful distance and watch her granddaughter point proudly at a finger-painted sun taped to a cafeteria wall. Caleb had agreed cautiously, the way he agreed to most things involving his mother by then, with conditions, with limits, with the quiet vigilance of a man who had learned not to assume good behavior just because enough time had passed. Eleanor showed up alone, dressed down from her usual country club polish, in a plain coat that looked almost unfamiliar on her. She stood near the back of the cafeteria, watching our daughter explain her painting to a cluster of other 4-year-olds with the serious, self-important focus only small children can manage. I watched Eleanor's face while she watched her granddaughter, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I saw something on it that wasn't performance. Just plain, unguarded longing, the look of someone watching a life continue happily without her in any central role. And finally, fully understanding that the absence was hers to own. Afterward, in the parking lot, while Caleb buckled Eleanor June into her car seat, Eleanor approached me alone. I tensed, out of old habit, bracing for whatever needling comment might come next. Instead, she said, "I know I don't get to undo it. I'm not asking you to tell me I do." I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then that silence was sometimes the strongest thing I could offer her, not punishment. Just the simple refusal to fill in her sentences with forgiveness she hadn't yet earned. I watched her in there, Eleanor continued, explaining her painting, completely unbothered, completely happy. And I realized she doesn't know anything happened. She doesn't carry any of it. You two made sure of that. Whatever else I think about how this all went, I know that took something. I know it took him, mostly, refusing to let it touch her. She paused, looking down at her hands, plain now, without the rings she used to wear, stacked 3 deep. I spent so many years thinking strength meant control, making sure things went the way I wanted, making sure I was the center of the story. It took losing almost everyone in my life to understand that strength looked like what you two did instead. Building something so steady that even my worst behavior couldn't reach the middle of it. "That's the first true thing you've ever said to me," I told her. And I meant it gently, not cruelly, an observation, not an attack. She almost smiled. "I know. I'm trying to get better at it. I don't expect it to fix anything between us. I think I just wanted you to know I finally see it. All of it, not just the locked door. The years before it too." I didn't hug her. I didn't tell her it was all forgiven, because it wasn't, not fully. And I've never believed that pretending otherwise does anyone any good. But I nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that," and meant it as exactly what it was, an acknowledgement, not an absolution. Some debts get paid in installments, if they get paid at all. And that conversation was, I think, the first real installment Eleanor ever made. Caleb, watching from the car, didn't ask what we'd talked about. He never pried into those moments, never tried to broker peace between us or nudge either of us toward forgiveness on a timeline that wasn't ours. He simply opened my door, waited until I was settled, and drove us home past the house with the locks only we controlled, past the porch that had once been the coldest place either of us had ever stood, toward the ordinary unremarkable, entirely ours evening waiting for us on the other side of it. That, I think, more than any of the reckonings or inheritances or whispered country club gossip, is what justice actually looked like in the end. Not Eleanor's ruin, just Eleanor finally seeing clearly, and the rest of us safe inside a life she could no longer reach the center of, going on without needing her to. Epilogue. Eleanor June is 4 now. She has her father's slow, careful way of noticing things, and I'll admit it, because it's true, and because I've made peace with it. Her grandmother's stubborn chin, the one Eleanor used to say she hoped the baby would inherit, though I doubt she ever imagined it attached to a girl who would grow up hearing, clearly and often, that love is something you prove with actions, not performances. We still send Eleanor a Christmas card. Caleb insists, and I've stopped arguing, because I understand now that this is his way of leaving a door cracked open without handing over a key. Some bridges, he says, you keep partially built, not because the other person deserves easy access, but because closing them completely costs you a piece of yourself you don't want to lose. Waldo remarried last year, to a soft-spoken widow named Carol, who laughs easily and has never once, in 18 months, made me feel like an outsider in my own family. He still cries sometimes, holding his granddaughter, the same unguarded tears from that first hospital room. I think some men spend half their lives learning, far too late, how to actually show up, and the lucky ones, like Walter, get just enough time left over to practice it properly before it's too late entirely. And me? I think about that cold porch sometimes, the crying baby, the deadlock that wouldn't turn. I think about how close I came to believing, in the haze of new motherhood and exhaustion, that maybe it really was just a mistake, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe peace was worth the price of my own dignity. I'm grateful, every single day, that I married a man who refused to let me believe that, who looked at a locked door and saw it for exactly what it was, who chose, on the hardest night of our lives, to build something unbreakable instead of something merely peaceful. That, in the end, is the whole story. Not the revenge, though it came, slowly and thoroughly, in ways Eleanor never saw coming and absolutely deserved. The real story is simpler than that, and truer. A good husband doesn't just love his wife. He defends her loudly and clearly, especially when his own family is the one trying to make her small. Everything else, the social reckoning, the inheritance, the slow unraveling of a woman who spent her whole life building a reputation she couldn't actually sustain. Once the truth got out, everything else was just the world. Eventually, agreeing with what Caleb already knew the moment he found that door wouldn't open. Please subscribe. New story is already waiting in line. Leave a comment too.